Good evening, Tom 580 classmates. I am excited to share with you my reflections and review of the Bernays text. I'm really excited to also hear and see what you guys have put together. I think that there is a lot that can be connected to the work that Bernays did and that he shares in this book. Um, I think it's always interesting to read from the words of a person themselves. So to get us started, we're going to have a quick review of the text, some of the main points that I've pulled out. Then we're going to look at the relation to strategic communication and what we've been studying. I'm going to pull out three useful tactics from Bernays' text and his work. Then we'll look at some theory integration, how the things that Bernays describes and proposes relate to modern theories. And then we'll wrap up with a conclusion. So throughout Bernays' work in crystallizing public opinion, there's a lot of depth there. Bernays really goes over what he views public opinion is, what public relations is, how he engineers consent. He gives examples of different campaigns he has run or helped run. He discusses the relation of public relations professionals with the media. At that time, it's primarily, obviously, newspapers. Um, and a lot of that, while it's over 100 years old now, well, nearing 100 years old, still relates directly to what we do today. He really did lay the foundation. Um, Bernays pioneered this concept of public relations. Honestly, he pioneered the concept of public opinion. Um, he proposed that communication was a two-way street, that individuals influence the public opinion through the media, and the media influences public opinion, that public relations professionals need to be aware of what the public wants, and they also need to be able to dictate that to the public. This is a central concept of what we're doing here today is, modern conceptions of communications and public relations is that it goes both ways. And we've seen this even more explicitly with the introduction of social media and commenting and reviews. Now more than ever, communication is a two-way street. I'll get into it a little more, but he discusses what engineering consent means. And he really pioneers the concept of using endorsements for products and ideas. A famous example is when he recruited models in a parade to smoke a certain brand of cigarettes to increase um, as a part of the Torches of Freedom campaign to kind of relate smoking cigarettes with both, sex appeal and femininity and America and patriotism to, relate those products. And so again, we still use these things today, endorsements from celebrities or endorsements from spokespeople, integrations in the media. These things are still used as sometimes paid, sometimes, deals brokered other ways. Along with that, Bernays really came up with a definition of public opinion. In his text, he describes that there really isn't a concept, a good definition of the word, and so he calls it the aggregate result of individual opinions. And with that, he says that no member of the public can easily describe what the public opinion is. They just kind of inherently know it. And it's a complex relationship. Like I mentioned, the public influences what the media at that time, what editors decided to share and prioritize, but also the media sets the public opinion. And Bernays views this as kind of this really delicate balance that goes back and forth, almost like a struggle that exists. And when it comes to engineering consent, Bernays discusses appealing to the base needs of humans. And so these are things like self preservation and social acceptance, food, shelter, sex. Um, and a lot of his basic breakdown really relates to modern concepts of developing campaigns. And so he proposes that um, communicators, public relations professionals should research or analyze the problem. They need to define objectives, and he doesn't call it this, but they need to target an audience, know who they're trying to communicate with. They need to create a plan of action and implement it. Um, and then they also need to look at how it has been covered. And so a lot of these things are basic, but Bernays was really one of the first to pioneer these concepts. So continuing on, as I discussed, Bernays is really the pioneer of public relations. And so, the major we're in is strategic communication. And really, strategic communication, it's a unique kind of modern mix of public relations, of communication studies, marketing and advertising, and philosophy. As we've already seen, if you're new to this program, you'll experience, and if you've been in it for a semester or two, you've taken a lot of classes that show you this kind of wide breadth of topics that are covered. Bernays really pioneered the field of public relations as professionals. He viewed it as on the same level as like a lawyer or a doctor, people who were educated well and could apply their understanding of public opinion to shape what people wanted, what they did, what they bought. And that's increasingly important. That's why we're in this program, as we see and we've been influenced by the culture we live in, and we know that we can, um, have careers where we strategically communicate and provide information and get people to buy products or support organizations. And Bernays is really kind of the pioneer of all of that. So I want to briefly go over 3 useful tactics. These are pretty basic things that Bernays proposes, but they're really interesting because they still can be applied today, and I'll kind of get more into detail in the next slide about 1 or 2 of them. The first useful tactic is using stereotypes strategically. Um, Bernays' definition of stereotype is a little different than our definition. Modern conceptions of stereotypes are more negative usually. But Bernays says that we can use and should use stereotypes to our advantage. So he describes a couple examples, one being this plan that was proposed in politics called the American Valuation Plan. And they had tied American to this plan to give it a sense of patriotism. And the opponents flipped it on its head by putting American in quotes and having it referred to as the valuation plan. So, this concept, the stereotype of American as patriotic, can also be flipped on its head by putting it into quotes and giving it a different conception. He discusses how he might brand a country in Europe like Austria. He says, there are these stereotypes of Austrians as belligerent, but we also love waltzes and the Danube River and things like that. And so we can bring forth those stereotypes and maybe be able to bring them to the forefront of Americans' opinions because they already exist, but why don't we make them these positive stereotypes? And he makes a good observation that any emblem or trademark of a trade is a type of stereotype. If you look at a picture, a stock photo of a doctor, they've got a lab coat on and they've got a stethoscope. A scientist has their, vials of various colored liquids. A programmer is behind a computer. He might have glasses. Maybe he's wearing a polo. These things are important because they can signal to us immediately what this person is and what they do. Um, Briefly, I mentioned this, but a tactic is appealing to basic human instincts. A lot of what we've discussed in our persuasion book is, the value of these things, but things like self-preservation and food, shelter, really on a broader level, social acceptance is powerful. Another example is another important tactic is using accepted forms of communication. Bernays really, not pioneers, he emphasizes that you need to meet an audience where they're at. You need to find where they want to receive information and where they like to receive information. Obviously, at the time he's talking about, it's various newspapers, maybe radio, but today it's even more important. We can apply that to social media networks. We know that we need to use LinkedIn for a certain type of customer, or Instagram for another, or a magazine for a certain demographic or psychological profile. These are all valuable. We need to make sure that our audience is going to receive the message where they're at. We can't, go after, teens on LinkedIn. That wouldn't be a match. So I think that is still a very useful tactic. And so again, to briefly go into modern theory integration with Bernays' work, Obviously, neither of these theories existed at Bernays' time, but I think a lot of the work that they found supports what Bernays did. And so I propose that Bernays' work in descriptions of stereotypes really relates to attitude accessibility. And so attitude accessibility basically says that people have strong connections with accessible emotions and symbols. So, if you see a flag, it might bring an accessible concept of patriotism for most people. Perhaps it brings an accessible concept of, soldiers, or an accessible concept for someone outside of America of maybe of colonization. But if you know your audience, you can kind of guess what their attitude that they will access by seeing a symbol is. So, Nike has tried to cultivate an accessible attitude and concept of fitness when you see their swoop. These are kind of like our filters for processing information. And Bernays' conception of stereotypes relates very closely to this. He says, maybe you need to basically be aware of what the accessible attitudes are and use them to your advantage, which is still super important today. And it's important to be able to develop things like stereotypes. He discusses Roosevelt, developing things like a New Deal. Today we see that with, for example, Donald Trump, who was well known for branding his opponents with a short symbol and creating a stereotype around them. It's still very valuable and important in our communication in today's world. The other theory in model is elaboration likelihood. In elaboration likelihood, we see central and peripheral route processing. So very basically, as we've all been reading, central route processing, usually high involvement individuals, they process the details of a situation, and those findings last longer in them. Whereas peripheral route, they're low involvement, they're not really paying attention. They probably paid more attention to the attractiveness of a concept. And so I would really relate Bernays' work with hairnets to this. So really briefly, you all read this, but there's a company, hairnets were going out of style because women wore bobbed hair, so they didn't need hairnets. And so Bernays kind of took two routes to increasing their sales. First, he polled kind of the fashion leaders and made some studies happen that showed that, the fashionable people liked longer hair. And so that's kind of a central, peripheral argument for hairnets, right? It's, oh, these really attractive people like wearing their hair long. So maybe I'll wear my hair long. And if you do that, you need a hairnet. And he also took a food safety route. So he also pursued kind of messaging around the, kind of issues that come up when you don't wear a hairnet. And that's more central route, whether it's a woman or a company looking at that saying, oh, that's a good argument that if you don't wear a hairnet, your hair might get in the food. And so he kind of took both routes to impact the problem. And according to him, the hairnets sales went way up. People wore their hair longer and bought more hairnets. So I think there's value to looking at those routes. And today we know and can look at that through the lens of elaboration likelihood. And so I looked at my time now and realized I've gone on much longer than I wanted to. So if you're still watching, thank you. But in a brief conclusion, Bernays was really central to the shaping of our American culture and public relations. He really was behind the development of our American culture of advertising and marketing and public relations, for better or for worse. Even in the introduction of my book, kind of discussed the pros and cons of what Bernays did. He did a lot of good. He really thought that being a public relations professional was important. Really made him mad when people put that title on and acted unethically. At the same time, he did a lot of work that wasn't pro-social. He supported a lot of big tobacco companies. Maybe you could argue the ethics of, using kind of fear to sell a product, things like that. But I think his high standard for public relations professionals, that they should be experts, that they need to be ethical, that they need to be the best at what they do, I think that's a standard we can look at and hold ourselves to. So thank you for watching if you made it this far, and I look forward to watching and reading your posts. Thanks.